Welcome to the Princeton Flying School podcast with Pete Rafle, Princeton Flying School Instructor Emeritus. In this episode, Pete sat down with Jeff Slutsky, Chief Pilot of the Princeton Flying School. Pete and Jeff talked about the current state of flight training, as well as some of the experiences they have encountered as flight instructors here at the Princeton Flying School. We trust this podcast will be helpful and informative and may at times even be entertaining for Princeton Flying School students and alumni here at Princeton Airport. So without any further introduction, let's join the conversation with Pete Rafle and Jeff Slutsky.
So I want to welcome everybody to another edition of the Princeton Flying School podcast. I'm Pete Rafle. I'm a former flight chief pilot at the school, and tonight I am inviting to join me Jeff Slutsky, who is the current chief pilot of the Princeton Flying School. And we're going to talk this morning about flight training and experiences that we flight instructors have encountered, may encounter, and how we can make training more effective and fun for our clients. So good morning, Jeff. How are you?
Good morning, Pete. Doing pretty well. Thanks for having me.
So how long have you been flying?
So I got my license initially in 1992. So I guess that makes it, 27 years now?
Yeah.
But my first flight actually was a demo flight when I was about 13 years old. My father and my brother decided to get their private pilot's licenses together. They were flying Tomahawks from way back when. And I was just a little bit jealous, and so I wanted to go as well. So they set me up for a demo flight, and we've all been through probably almost everyone's been through a demo flight at one point. And I was really excited the day before, and I was looking forward to talking on the radio. And I remember my father helped me with the radio calls because it was a Towered Airport. It was a Republic in Long Island. And so I practiced, Piper 1, 2, 3, 4 is holding short of runway, whatever it was, at Alpha, ready for departure. And I practiced that maybe 20 times so that I would be able to use the radio the next day, because for some reason that seemed to be a really important part of flying to me. And then it's really funny because I got out there and I practiced, saying Piper, 2, 3, 4. And then that day, my father was flying Piper 2, 3, 4 at the same time. And I was flying whatever, Piper 4, 5, 6. And I got up to the hold short line and I said, Piper 2, 3, 4, holding short of runway, whatever. And my father to pipe up, no, I'm Piper 2, 3, 4. I'm not holding short. So that was my introduction to aviation when I was 13 years old. And my father and brother got their licenses. And then I got old enough to start flying myself, and funds in my family run out. And I didn't get the chance to train when I was a kid. So I had that, the little taste of aviation, but I never got to fully scratch the itch. So as soon as I graduated college and started working and making money and had disposable income, I was actually working nights at that time, I was immediately ready to throw all my disposable income into flying. And that's when I finally got my private pilot's license way back when.
Yeah. Did you go back to the Piper Tomahawk?
No, I flew in a Cessna 172, just like we have here at the school.
I remember once in a Piper Tomahawk, and the instructor said, we're going to do some stalls, but I want you to look over your shoulder, take a look at what happens to the tail. And it was doing kind of lazy eights there, rotating itself around. And I decided I didn't want to fly that airplane again.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember, they nicknamed it the Tomahawk back then.
Yes, indeed.
You don't see too many of those around anymore, thankfully, I think.
Yeah, the one I flew was at Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I remember that well. So then how did you get into flight instruction?
So while I was working, I did as many other hobby flyers do. When it's time to come up for a flight review, which was still called a biennial flight review back then, I'd like to add ratings. So I got my instrument rating, I got my multi-engine rating, I got my commercial single, I got my commercial multi. So I kind of, went my way up the scale. And then finally, way back in 2006, I decided that I had enough of my previous career And I said, I want to start enjoying my life and be working around people I actually enjoy. And so I quit. And then I was like, what should I do with myself? So I said, maybe I'll become a flight instructor. And I went ahead and I got my MEI, my II, and my CFI. And then maybe I should have thought about it a little bit more at the time before I did that. But after I was done, I was like, do I really want to work really hard and not make a lot of money at it? And I was like, no, I don't want to do that. So I got my ratings, and then I completely put them aside, and I went to vet school. And I was there for 3 years, had a health issue, had to leave, and then moved to New Jersey. And then I was back again saying, what should I do? And somehow I was like, maybe I'll do the flight instructing thing, even though I don't think I'm going to make any money at it. And that's how I ended up here at Princeton.
So you're going to be a flying vet? Is that what you were thinking of doing?
No, they were two completely unrelated things. But I thought about it. I thought it'd be like, maybe I could be like animal ambulance pilot or something like that.
Yeah, like they have in Australia, they have these guys.
Yeah, and then also out in the areas where it's kind of less urban, there is a lot of need to fly animals sometimes to care facilities and stuff like that, but not really in New Jersey.
Okay. So after that, how did you come to Princeton from someplace? So where were you before?
So I was in Philadelphia at vet school, and then my wife was at Princeton as a PhD student. So then when I left vet school, I moved down here to join her in Princeton. And then I wanted to get back into flying, so I came to the Princeton airport, and I got my flight review, and I got my IPC, and I was back in flying. And I flew the if I can recall, one of the 172P models that has since been destroyed. We sold. That was the one that we sold and got destroyed by the movie company.
Oh yes,
yeah. 54020, I think it was.
020.
Yeah, and I was not really in love with that airplane, so that was why I brought the Diamonds to Princeton, because I thought maybe if we had some newer, more sophisticated aircraft, it would be something that people would like to see, and that's how I ended up here instructing.
So we still have one P on the line.
We have an N now as well.
Really?
Yes, we've just added, because we were a little running out of capacity, so we added, but it's a very nice N. It has a nice interior, nice paint job, a Garmin 430. So it actually is in pretty good shape for a less recent aircraft.
Yeah, for those of you who are airplane spotters, somewhere on this campus there is a Cessna 172 Delta, I believe, with a geared motor in it, geared engine.
I've flown the Gulf model. I don't think I've done the Delta yet.
So now that you're at that point, you were an instructor, and you were hired by Princeton Flying School to be an instructor?
Correct.
And how did that, what was your first impressions of doing that after vet school and having got all these ratings? And
so there's two things that come to mind immediately. The first is, I think we've probably all heard the expression about professional pilots that it's hours of boredom followed by sheer moments of terror. Well, I never found that to be really true when I started as a flight instructor. In fact, I found it was quite the opposite. It was hours of terror followed by moments of boredom. And that amount of terror that you have as a flight instructor slowly starts to get less and less over time, but I don't think it fully goes away as you slowly learn what your students are trying to do to you.
I understand that.
So that was my first impression. But the other thing on a just more positive note is that one of the things I really enjoyed when I started working here is that almost, well, not 100%, but for a large part of the community, pilots, it's just really fun to be around pilots. It's a good group of people. They're mostly not jerks. Most of the people who come to the airport come because they love aviation and they really like flying. So for them, this is a great thing to do. And it was really a nice change, especially from my time in finance, where you're surrounded by, backstabbing, cutthroat, immoral, jerky people. So it was a really nice change for me, and that was probably one of the strongest impressions I liked. I just really liked coming to the airport. I liked being with people like you, Pete, and like the students. And then, I mean, I don't really do intro flights anymore, but I have to say that one of the most pleasing things to do is when you do an intro flight with someone and they get back on the ground and they're like, that was the best experience I've ever had in my life. Thank you so much. Like, you've made a big difference. And that was, especially when you're starting out, you do a lot of intro flights.
Sure.
So that was a really nice feeling to feel that, hey, like I've made this person happy. And sometimes we could get away from that a little bit, especially as instructors, where we get kind of caught up in just the mundane details of what we have to teach people. But people are doing something that they love, and to share that with them is really, I think it's a really nice thing. It's something I still try to remind myself of from time to time and enjoy.
Yeah, many pilots take longer to master certain skills, and so the time repetitive flights trying to get those skills up to where you want them, where they know what the goals should be, can be frustrating.
Yeah, it can. I mean, that's like, especially, pre-solo students trying to learn how to land. Sometimes it's very easy to sort of lose sight of like, hey, this is supposed to be a fun thing and you're going to eventually get this. And as instructors, sometimes we could get a little perhaps bored flying around the pattern for the 28th time that day, trying to help your student to land. But, in the end, and that's another thing is, when you watch and then this, and you've done it a number of times as well, when a student solos, it's impossible to remove the smile from their face. I think that if you watch them like 5 hours later in the day, they're still smiling and maybe still walking around with the back of their shirts cut off. So that's always a really good feeling, is that watching them after the first solo, and maybe after when they pass the check ride as well. I think those are two really big things in a pilot's life.
So we're keeping, in this day of advanced airplanes and technology, we're still keeping the tradition of cutting off the tails of their shirts when they solo, right?
We are indeed.
Yeah. And you require flight instructors to get out on the runway or be next to the runway when a solo is taking place, or
yeah, we usually go out in the grass area here by the runway sign, so we have a good look of the entire pattern, so we could watch our students land. We could look for other air traffic and keep an eye on them for the first solo for sure, and then usually we do the second supervised solo the same way.
Yeah. So you do fewer introductory flights now. You spend most of your time on advanced students, or
I mostly do advanced students or students with more complicated aircraft. So if we have a private pilot here with who bought a Cardinal RG. So I'll work with him instead of flying maybe in a 172, or if someone's flying the Diamond, I'll fly that as well, maybe as a private student. But mostly what I'm doing is instrument rating, commercial, multi-engine stuff, ATP, those kind of things. Of course, I do all the flight instructor training as well.
Sure. Yeah, one of the real joys of flight instruction is that your clients have wonderful airplanes, and you get to fly things that you would not normally ever get yourself into.
Absolutely. And just the other day, one of our clients was demoing the Cirrus Vision Jet, so I got to be on board while that demo flight was going on, and maybe in the back of my mind hoping I get typed in the aircraft as well, but. That was really a nice experience. So that's not the kind of thing you would normally get to do on your own dime.
Yeah, was that your first turbine-powered airplane, or?
Yes, it is. And it's interesting because even with my limited knowledge base of turbine aircraft, the Vision Jet, this is probably something that you'd be interested in, is really an aircraft that is designed for a private pilot type who does not have a lot of experience and is not very good at managing systems, so that everything is really automated in that aircraft from the startup to the shutdown. It's a really, really simple aircraft to fly. And in a lot of ways, I think maybe it is the future of aviation, that you don't have to worry about pressurization. It does it all for you. You don't have to worry about overspeeding when you put the flaps of the gear down, because it won't let you do it. It'll just keep them up until you get the speed correctly. You don't have to worry about like hot start or anything like that. You push a button, if anything goes wrong, it just shuts it down. It's a very automated aircraft, so that the pilot themselves don't have to handle all those complex systems. So it's a very interesting direction for general aviation.
Yeah. I'm going to sound sort of dinosaur-ish by saying that it kind of shakes me a little bit to think of a pilot not really getting involved in the operation of the airplane, just pushing buttons and making things happen. Don't have to worry about when I lower the gear because the machine's going to do it for me. When the gear doesn't come down, how do they react? If the pressurization doesn't perform well, does it just shut itself down and tell you, go lower, go lower, go lower? What happens?
So that's a fair question, and I think that those are probably the questions that a lot of aircraft engineers struggle with right now. It's like what to do, how to train the pilots. Now, a Vision Jet has a type rating, so to that degree, you're still trained in emergency procedures, and although I haven't gone through the course, it's 3 weeks with them, and then there's all the time ahead of time before you get there. So, I mean, they are, I hope, preparing pilots for those scenarios, but I could think about some other situations that we have like that. So, and maybe because I went and did the serious training in the SR-22, I have a little, that kind of comes to mind. So they have the electronic stability protection in the aircraft right now. And one of the things that's part of that program is if you have a SR-22T with a turbo, what happens when you're flying at high altitudes, and what happens if you start to get hypoxic. So what the engineers have done there, for example, is that if you touch none of the buttons on the aircraft, in the amount of time that's the time of useful consciousness, depending on your altitude, then the aircraft prompts you and says, hey, are you still awake? And then it gives you a certain amount of time to respond. I think it's 2 minutes if I recall. And if you don't respond, it asks you one more time, hey, are you still there? And if you don't respond, the aircraft will descend down below oxygen levels and wait for you to take control of the aircraft. And that kind of system to me, so dinosaur or no, we know sometimes people lose consciousness in aircraft. And what should we do about it? Well, we could go the professional route and have quick donning masks and teach them what happens in a pressurization, but we still have was it like Payne Stewart?
Yes.
Right? Who sometimes there's a slow depressurization, you don't notice, and you're unconscious. Wouldn't it be nice that the aircraft could remind you, hey, how you doing? And that's kind of the approach that they've taken for that particular situation, to say, okay, you need to have oxygen. You should know you're having oxygen. And if you're up here, we want to make sure that everything's still going okay. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, in that case, the plane's taking over for you, and there are obviously some risks involved in that. Mm-hmm. But I think it's kind of a good idea. There was recently an accident, though, the one in Texas, SR-22T. Pilot lost consciousness. The plane descended down to lower altitude, went out over the Gulf of Mexico, and pilot didn't even gain consciousness, and then eventually ran out of fuel and crashed. So there's still a limit to what we can do. Yeah. Another example of automation, a couple of things just come to my mind when you ask this question, of automation like this, and what should we do about it? So the big thing that a lot of people are critical of the service is that the POH says at 500 feet, thou shalt engage the autopilot. And thou shalt use the autopilot for the entire flight until you reach, if it's an instrument approach, minimums 200 feet or whatever, or if it's a visual approach, 500 feet, and disconnect the autopilot and hand land. And I know for you probably that's a very interesting development. And then, so Cirrus pilots are being trained to rely on their autopilots. That brings up some risks. And we have some Cirrus pilots who are like, hey, my autopilot's great. I'm not an instrument-rated pilot, but I'm just going to fly right through those clouds because the autopilot's doing it and it's not going to screw up. And we know that's happening. We had a pilot, not that I'm involved in this process, but just we as the aviation community, there was a pilot who went up and engaged his autopilot. He was flying in the clouds at, 12,500 feet. And then the autopilot disconnected, because what happens every once in a while? Autopilots disconnect. Whatever goes wrong, we see it all the time. And now he's IMC, and he doesn't know what to do. And then what did he do? He had a loss of control. Okay, got into an unusual attitude. I don't remember exactly what happened. Now, in the Cirrus case, we only know about this story because he had that parachute above him. He pulled the parachute, he floated down, and he admitted what he was doing, which I have to say is kind of brave. And sort of proud of that because that brings up that these things are happening. Now, there's other pilots doing that who aren't flying aircraft that have parachutes or have level buttons or whatever, and they're getting themselves in trouble. So we have loss of control accidents VFR into IMC. Now we have an example of one where we could see, like, hey, how did this develop? And is the automation the problem here, or is it the solution? I don't know. I don't think there's an easy answer. But I really see that it kind of goes both ways. So I don't know. Those are just a couple of things that I sort of think of with that particular aircraft. When all our instrument training these days is pretty much done in G1000 aircraft at Princeton now, whether it's the Baby Diamonds, the DA-40s, or the twin train, the DA-42, we're using G1000. So I'm really seeing, what is it like to train people from the start in instrument training to use automation, and there's a balance there. The beginning of training, how much do we use the autopilot? 0. We don't basically use it at all at first because basic attitude instrument flying is still basic attitude instrument flying. And it doesn't make a difference whether you have six round steam gauges or whether you have a glass cockpit. Scan is scan, and instrument interpretation is instrument interpretation. So I don't really believe that, and maybe I'm in the minority here, I don't really believe there's that much difference between training a pilot with automation or without automation, because there's still the same skills of being a pilot. And then we slowly add in the autopilot. Okay, you have to brief the approach. Why not put the autopilot on and just hold your heading and hold your altitude so that you could look down at the approach without worrying whether you're going to go woo and end up in an unusual attitude. So that's the way we teach it. Then we throw in every once in a while, do a coupled approach. And what happens if you find yourself in weather you're not comfortable with? Use the autopilot. If you're flying, on a 5-hour flight down to South Carolina, do you need to hand fly it the whole time? No. I mean, there's no real benefit to that. So we use the autopilot. I'm really very strict about using your instruments for interpretation. If you're flying an ILS, you have a ILS needle in front of you. Here's your localizer. Here's your glide slope over here. Keep those needles centered, and you're going to end up the day in a very good position. I don't like, and a lot of pilots are used to this, not because of airplanes, but because of their cars, where they're looking over to their right all the time and following the little magenta line. Because if you're like my wife and you drive a Tesla and you have autopilot on in the car, you're used to letting the car do everything for you. And you look over there and you follow the route on the map. And I don't let my students do that. They'll rely on that. They'll think that the MFD, the multifunction display with the moving map, is their primary instrument. That's not instrument flying. So although we have automation and we have more advanced tools, those tools are still just part of our toolkit, in my view. And you still teach the basics, and you just integrate the other stuff in for situational awareness, for safety factors. So that's the kind of the way that I handle automation in our training, and I hope most people are doing that as well. Just one last thought before I let you sort of jump in is I spend a lot of time on aviation forums on like Facebook and stuff like that, and there's a lot of debate about some of these issues, and I get sometimes frustrated with the rigidity, hopefully not from you, but we'll see, the rigidity of some of the other instructors who you can't teach people primary training in a technically advanced aircraft. You can't teach them basic instrument training in a technically advanced aircraft. And I think that's completely wrong. You have to teach basics before you teach advanced systems. That I agree with. But I don't find that there's any problem with any of the pilots that I've trained in their actual physical skills of flying the plane, as long as you, as the instructor, make sure that they learn that first. And the last part about it is there's no question that when you have more technically advanced aircraft, it does add time to the training process, because you have to learn more things. So to me, that's the biggest drawback, especially when money continues to be obviously an issue in aviation and will never go away. So anyway, I don't know how you feel about those things, but I feel very strongly about automation is not necessarily a bad thing, but flying skills are still important.
Well, I agree with virtually everything you've said.
Wait, hold a second. Let me get my breath here, Pete. That may be first.
But after 56 years in aviation, having gone from needle ball, and GCA.
Did you do 4 course?
I did. I was the last class in the Navy to learn how to use the diddy dots, da-da, da-da, and all that kind of stuff. I would be very comfortable with you as my instrument instructor in an advanced airplane.
Thank you.
And I as long as we start with the basics, and there is a basic instrument in advanced airplanes, there is an artificial horizon, there is a ball thing that shows you what's up and what's down, and the scan indeed is important. But I can't believe that you haven't been startled by students while they were flying this advanced, can't get you in trouble kind of airplane.
So it's
not
funny.
saying that you had lost attention to what they were doing, but button pushing happens at a time sometimes.
Well, I mean, it's funny. So 2 things come to mind. Steve Hensel, who's one of our fine flight instructors here.
Indeed, one of my students, by the way.
When you're a student, exactly. He told me that when I started doing my instrument students, that you're going to find that your students every student is going to at some point put you in some unusual attitude, and you're going to have to recover, and you have to really pay attention to that. And I had that in the back of my mind when I started with my instrument students. And coincidence, the aircraft, I don't know, but I've almost never, we do have some stories where this happened, but I've almost never had that happen to me. And I think that's partly because of the advanced aircraft we're flying. I think a lot of times when that happens, comes from distractions. And what I teach my students from very early is when you have distractions, engage the autopilot, deal with what you have to deal with. If you have to brief an approach, if you have to do a lot of programming on a new route, that's when in an older aircraft that doesn't have an autopilot that you get yourself in a lot of trouble, because there's a lot of head downs time and they have to look like this. So we don't do a lot of that in advanced aircraft. Now we have to do it to some degree, because and some examiners won't let you even use the autopilot on the check ride. But I want them not to get themselves in that situation in real life. So maybe I haven't seen that as much. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing that maybe that's made it a little bit easier on the student. On the other hand, or maybe on the same hand, to be honest, I picked up a student from another instructor, and he was flying a steam gauge 172, and he was one of those guys who just stared at the 430, the Garmin 430. So he had much less automation than I'm used to using, didn't have a working autopilot, and he was reliant on the 430 for situational awareness. Mm. And then he wanted to go IMC with me on one day, and it was solid IMC. He could not fly IMC. He'd been flying for a while, instruments. He was, well advanced, but couldn't hold altitude, couldn't hold heading. He's looking over at the Garmin 430 all the time. And honestly, for me, that was one of the least enjoyable flights I've had as a flight instructor, because if I'm flying the plane IMC, I'm not stressed at all. I'm I'm keeping the plane nice and steady, and it wasn't bumpy or anything. Well, maybe it was a little bumpy, whatever. And I don't have to worry much because I trust my instrument scan. And I still trust my instrument scan when he's flying, except I've got to sit there and be like, okay, your altitude's off. You got to get down, and you got to get your wings level again. And we have to get back on heading, and you have to tune this radio, and and then for me, it was really stressful. And I just didn't enjoy it because he just wasn't really trained well to have a good instrument scan. And all he had was one little GPS navigator that was screwing him up. And then after that, I was like, you can't use this anymore. And then actually in that flight, I turned it to the traffic page or something. Like, screw it. You're not looking at that anymore. And his flying improved slightly, but he just wasn't really ready for it. So I'm not really ready to impugn automation in those situations. Because I think that, people can have crappy scans with just about any aircraft.
And those of us who taught majority of our instrument training prior to the Garmin 1000, that's exactly what we found, was distraction and a poor scan that you had to take the student back, rebuild the scan, and then go forward again.
And we still have to do that, though. I mean, every once in a while, I just have to be like, your scan is going away again, and you need to focus on doing that. And then sometimes just a little mild, kick in the rear gets them back to doing that again. But
I have just one quick question about teaching in an advanced airplane that you brought up, and how do you simulate failures without having the whole system have to be darkened? I remember being with someone who just blackened the MFD. And
right. So that's a good question, and in some degrees it depends on what are they going to do after they get their instrument rating. So most of the students that I'm flying with, if they're getting the instrument rating in the DA-40, they're going to be flying the DA-40 here, and they're going to be renting the DA-40, or the other majority of the people are going on to be professional pilots, and they're going to be flying glass cockpits. So I'm not really worried about what's going to happen when you're flying a 172 and you lose the vacuum system, because it's not applicable to a plane that doesn't have a vacuum system, right? So we still have this inclination to want to fail the attitude indicator and the heading indicator, because that's what happens when you lose your vacuum pump. And then, in G1000, yeah, we could lose our AHRs, and we could lose the heading indicator and the attitude indicator at the same time, because they're on the same circuit breaker, even though they're two separate components. So we can lose them at the same time, but we have a backup attitude indicator. So what am I going to do? Am I going to fail their attitude indicator here and their attitude indicator over there, and then because I want to simulate what would happen in a vacuum airplane? No. Well, if you're going to go fly a 172 with a vacuum gauges, let's go back and get trained on a 172. You're in the wrong airplane. So that's not really very relevant. So what are realistic failures? So yes, losing the AHRs, so losing your attitude and your heading, and having to look up top in the diamond and see your attitude indicator, having to still use the good old magnetic compass. Okay, that's still a skill that we have to train. So I will just fail those two instruments. I'm okay doing with the circuit breaker, although it's not really the best thing to do sometimes. I'll also just fail the PFD. Okay, the PFD will fail, and then you'd be surprised that just having to, we have reversionary mode where all the primary flight instruments go over to the MFD now. You would be surprised that students have trouble flying the plane looking over to their right. They have all the instruments they had before. They don't have the moving map anymore because they just have the little inset. But I train them, okay, now you're going to look at the right. Okay, now what happens? We do sometimes just fail the whole PFD and let them use the moving map. What if reversionary mode fails? Is that possible? I don't really know the logic well enough, but I haven't practiced that as well. And then once I have students who are passed, ready for the check ride, either before or after the check ride, what I like to do with them is fail the PFD, fail the MFD. Okay, now we just have backup instruments. How are you navigating? Well, for most pilots, get out your iPad. Okay, now let's see, can you, under the foggles, fly with just the backup instruments and navigate with your iPad at your lap? Because that's a realistic scenario, because now we're talking about an electrical failure in the aircraft. So again,
no autopilot in that situation.
No autopilot as well. They have to hand fly.
You've got to set up your iPad, which probably has already been set up.
Yeah,
right?
So
they're always using it as a backup anyhow.
Right, and then people who have, mostly if we have an iPad, we also have a backup phone or something, because especially in this weather, and I saw it even yesterday, instrument student, iPad overheated. Cockpit was too hot. So we have a backup of the backup as well. But anytime I do a partial panel, I do not let them use the autopilot, because I'm going to assume that whatever's caused the partial panel problem is taking out their autopilot. So we still, the good old-fashioned, dump a lot of failures on people and see what happens. We still do that and hope for the best.
Yeah, you're still thinking about where is the nearest VFR situation.
And of course, we discussed that as well. But we know that when we're solid IMC, a lot of times there is no place but to do an instrument approach.
Right.
But I don't find that initially there's always people have a little bit of trouble. But once you train a little bit, it's not really a problem. And I do hope that students, after they get their instrument rating, do train that, because those skills go away quickly.
Yeah, indeed.
Just like anything.
Right. So times are changing.
Times are changing for sure.
And you certainly are preparing people well to take advantage of the new technology and the new times.
I hope so. But, and the funny thing is, maybe when I come back on another day, most of the stories that I have are still about basic piloting skills. I mean, it's not often where I say, like, oh, the autopilot caused us a problem, we didn't handle it. It's still like, oh, you have to use your rudder. Yeah, you have to use your rudder, or you have to stay coordinated, or you have to, remember procedure and follow your checklist. I mean, it's still the very basic problems that are still occurring with pilots.
Yeah. I talked to a fellow who had studied the Ethiopian 737 MAX crash, and he was concerned about basic pilotage skills. When the airplane pitched down, they didn't adjust the throttles at all, and that's why it oversped. So then, when they tried to pull back, they've got this excess speed. The trim is overcome. So there's a pilotage skill for a professional pilot in the airlines who just...
I hear that, and yet, I mean, I've trained a fair amount of people for their ATPs, and these are usually people who are either coming from the military, or they're like flying for something like Plane Sense or Wheels Up, people like that. So already have a lot of time, and they just need to get their ATP so they could like work for the majors or something like that. And in some cases, even people who've had European ATPs and want to get a US ATP. And I have to be honest, I don't see a problem with piloting skill for the actual physical skills. Of all the pilots I've trained, I can only think of one of them who was just so over-reliant on aileron trim, she couldn't like hold the plane steady. It took her a while. I was flying the Seminole. She's like, where's the aileron trim? And we don't have aileron trim. You have to actually hold the plane. And she had a little bit of trouble. But that was one out of, a couple of dozen that maybe I've seen that had any problem with physical skills. I'm actually usually fairly impressed that, these people come in, they're professional, they know how to fly the plane, they know how to, in various regimes, they don't have any trouble with like single engine work or doing approaches. So, maybe there are pilots out there in the rest of the world that maybe aren't as well trained as the U.S. military or the, some of the airlines here, but I really don't see that problem so much. Now, I don't know, maybe if you're flying 777s, but even then, I know a guy who was flying 777s for like 30 years, and he's still like great hand skills. So I just don't really see it. Obviously, it must exist, but my experience has not been along those lines. I mean, I've had some of the most enjoyable experiences just sitting back and watching them do all the maneuvers, and I could just basically relax for once.
Yeah, we all have our stories, but I certainly enjoyed my career as an instructor, and you seem to be enjoying it as much or even more. And a year from now, what does aviation look like? Or 10 years from now, what do you have any vision of where we're going to be?
Yeah, I mean, 2 years ago, I remember getting into an argument with someone about autonomous aircraft. And I always said, I mean, it's definitely coming. And they're like, no way. Like, we're not going to have autonomous aircraft for decades. And 2 years later, I think we're already seeing, this is the future of aviation. And I have to say, it makes me a little sad. You see Airbus and Boeing, and they're testing pilotless aircraft. I think that for sure they're going to want to move down to one pilot, at least on the, the airline level, to save costs. And, whether it's Amazon delivering packages or whatever else, it seems like that's, air taxi, that seems to be the direction of the future. Diamond has already demonstrated a DA-42 with Autoland. Okay, so it's an emergency. And if you look on the website of the equipment, it's already listed as optional equipment. So they're certifying it right now. So the pilot passes out, heart attack, whatever. Spouse could sit there and push a button, and it will go to the nearest ILS. It will descend, it will fly, it will flare, and it will land. And I mean, if we could do that in the DA-42, why can't, we have auto land already and 777s and, whatever, A350s, whatever. Why do we think that we really need pilots? Well, when things go wrong, we think we need us. But I don't know. I think that that's really the future, and it's kind of makes me a little sad. It makes me wonder what we'll be doing. Will we be the we's of the future be training remote pilots how to pilot aircraft? I guess we don't have to worry about them killing us then, but it's not going to
they
quite.
Call those programmers, don't they?
Pretty much.
Call them instructors.
I mean, they still they still fly, but it's not. It's really not the same thing. So, I think that's it's a little bit sad, but it's definitely it's what's the advancement. It's the way the future is. But there's always going to be a place for hand flying a plane. I mean, we're still flying Piper Cubs and such.
Well, there's still that great world of aviation that's for pleasure, that's just to experience flight.
Yeah, it's an interesting question about that. I find that flying in the Northeast, that's a little bit, I wouldn't say lost completely, but de-emphasized or harder to experience. Because when you have, you hear, Donald Trump's coming, for 17 days in August, and then you have to deal with TFRs, and you have to talk to ATC, and you have to get a score code, you have to file a flight plan, and then it's very regulated. Like, where's the fun in that? I mean, it really isn't. But if you're flying in the center of the country, and there is no Delta airspace around, there is no Bravo airspace around, there's no Charlie airspace around, you just want to take a plane up and have some fun and do some maneuvers, it's a lot easier, it's a lot less stressful. So I feel like to some degree we're not in an country that encourages that very much. And I think a large proportion of the pilots that we train here, the younger ones obviously are career-oriented, looking to get careers for the most part. We don't see as many young people, just flying for the fun of it. That's mostly the more mature client. And a lot of them is to go places. They don't take up a plane and go out to the practice area and, fly around. They want to go to Virginia. They want to go to, Maine. They want to go to Nantucket. So it's a transportation machine. And that's what I used aviation for when I first started doing it back in the 90s. So I'm very well familiar with that. But I think it's the sleepy airport where there's one guy flying a glider and another guy's in a Piper Cub without a radio, and someone else has maybe got these days a trike or something like that. That's not something you're going to see a lot of in New Jersey or New York or Connecticut. No. So I think there's a bifurcation of what's going on in aviation. The fun part's always going to be there, but in highly regulated airspace, it's hard to imagine. I mean, you need ADS-B as of January 1st at Princeton.
That's right.
Because we're in the Mode C Veil. I mean, that kind of precludes a lot of certain types of flying. So,
well, whether it's for fun or as a potential career or advanced or good old 172s, I think Princeton Flying School is the place to be. And I think you're a great asset to this organization, and I can't thank you enough for joining me this morning.
Well, thanks for letting me.
It's been a great conversation, and it's covered a lot of the things that I wanted to cover, so I thank you for that.
Well, thanks for having me here, Pete. It's been a pleasure as well.
Thank you. And folks, please stay in touch with us. We'll do another one in August, and we'll try to, if you have any concerns or any thoughts about what we should be discussing, just send me a note via the Princeton Flying School, and we'll make sure we got the right speaker for that. But I hope you enjoyed, as much as I did, having Jeff Slutsky discuss flight instruction, advanced airplanes, and flight training in general. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
See you in the air.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Princeton Flying School podcast with Pete Rafle. Our podcasts are recorded at the Princeton Airport and are produced by HG Media. If you enjoyed our show, please share it with your friends. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you listen to podcasts.